But first, today Kansans reacting after President Trump signs an executive order mandating drug companies lower prescription drug costs.
One local pharmacy warning people that they may not see some of those reductions at the register. Sophia Jernander explains why.
On Monday, President Trump signed an executive order asking pharmacies to reduce prescription drug costs. Some people are used to paying high prices for cancer treatment and insulin, and they say they're happy change is being made.
I got a lower cancer. Yeah, I got the pills, special pills. They cost more than $2,000.
I like it because I know that they're too expensive the way things are right now.
While people are relieved that their prescription drugs may be more affordable, local pharmacists are warning people not to get their hopes up quite yet because they may not see these price reductions at the register.
The list price of the medication is beneficial to their payers. So the government and the, say, employer are going to see reductions in their net cost of drugs. However, they may not translate that to the register.
Dan Davis works with El Dorado True Care Pharmacy. He explains that the executive order specifically affects the list price of prescription drugs, which are usually paid by a third party and not the consumer.
There's a lot of drivers in this environment that are causing price disturbances right now.
Davis expresses a sense of hope and optimism about the executive order, but he believes it ultimately falls short of what is needed to address what he says are flaws within the healthcare system.
It's step one in a long journey, and that I hope that the consumers will continue to advocate for change. Sometimes that's reaching out to your state legislators and letting them know that drug prices are a concern and not giving up just because a surface level change has been made.
In El Dorado, Sophia Jernander, 12 News.
And pharmacists are also warning that tariffs could also have an impact on the cost of some drugs.